Okay. Hi, Ellen. How are you?
I'm fine, Douglas. How are you today?
Doing great. Thank you. Thank you for coming on this
Good.
show. I appreciate it.
I'm delighted.
So, I was looking at your bio. You've written a book called Lead How Women in Charge Claim Their Authority, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. I want to get a little bit of your backstory. You were a nun,
Okay. I was for 18 years.
18 years. Wow.
Uh-huh.
Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, the backstory to that is when I was 12 years old, I announced to my parents I was going to be a priest when I grew up. And our family, the parish priest was visiting when I did this, and the three of them looked at each other like, is anyone going to tell her she can't be a priest because she's a girl? So that was the beginning. And I still was looking for a life that had community and service and education. And I went to a Jesuit university and I wanted to be a Jesuit, but again, I couldn't because I was a woman. But I eventually found an order of women who were considered the female Jesuits. And for 18 years, I very happily was part of the mission. I taught, I worked as a campus minister, and I lived in community with incredibly smart, talented women.
Do you think the Catholic Church needs to change that? Because the Anglican Church in Britain has women priests, and they've had for years.
That would be another whole show
That'd be
and
another.
conversation, but absolutely
Okay.
yes. I went through a stage in my early 20s when I was determined to become an Episcopalian so I could be ordained. But I realized that our roots in terms of religion are often quite powerful, and I stayed a Catholic and was never ordained. But yes, they definitely have to change all of their attitudes about women.
Okay, so 18 years, then you left. Why did you leave?
I was in graduate school and I turned 40, and those are both factors that lead to big changes. But I think what had happened was the Catholic Church had become even more conservative and made life even more difficult for religious women. I also found that we had diminished in numbers. So we were living in smaller and smaller groups, and there wasn't quite the sense of community that I had found so appealing. But I also saw that it was possible to be about my mission, to change the world for the sake of one woman at a time. I could do that without being a nun. And I'm still very close to the community and see them regularly, but it was an important change in how I was going to live out my life.
So currently you are running a company, or you have your own company. Is it a? I couldn't quite figure out what it was from your bio. Is it a
So it's
leadership
really a
coaching?
sole practitioner. At
Okay.
this point, I am an executive coach. I work with C-suite and VP women leaders. I do some writing, I do some speaking. But after Harvard, I actually started a consulting company and had a team of people, and we went into Fortune 500 companies and did coaching and mentoring and programs. And after that, I moved to California and decided I liked doing the work more than I liked running a business. So I changed again. And then I was hired by a client and spent 6 years in-house doing leadership and talent development.
So you're doing primarily leadership coaching, but for women in executive positions.
Correct, correct. My doctoral work was on women's psychological development, and my focus was on the difference between holding leadership and exercising leadership and holding a role of authority. So I've always been focused on women. I've always been focused on accelerating their strengths, not trying to fix them in any way. And I've tried to always work at the top of organizations because I think that's where you have the greatest impact, not just with an individual, but for the whole org.
In your observations. Is there still disparity between when you get to the executive vice president, CEO level in terms of lack of women in these positions? Is it still male dominated?
Absolutely. We have definitely made progress. There are more women in the C-suite, although not dramatically more numbers on boards or CEOs. But the percentages are still very discouraging. And the compensation, women still on average make 80 cents on the dollar of a white man. And there are still many structural and systemic obstacles to women's success.
Well, it's sad to hear that the pay is still an issue. Why is that? Why is that still an issue?
Well, I could say that's the $64,000 question, but I won't give that as my answer. I think there are a number of factors. I think that women don't always know how to negotiate as readily as men do. Your career comp is very much affected by your early compensation because each job is a rise from where you started. So if women don't know how to ask for a higher raise when they're coming in or higher comp when they're coming in, it hits them all the way up. I also think that men share advice on how to get good compensation packages, and they have more of them to turn to. I love the story when Gayle King was being hired by one of the TV shows, and she turned to Oprah, her friend, and Oprah was like, ask for a lot, just go for it. And in my coaching, I have found women very resistant to ask for a lot, despite the fact that they're worth it.
Do you think they're afraid that they'll just get turned down altogether and not get the job at all?
I think it's actually lack of experience, and so lack of comfort with something that feels unusual. I think they usually know they'll get the job, but there is a certain socialization that happens to girls and women to play nice and to not ask for too much. And I think that still impacts women. And I think men could do a great service to advancing women by making offers that they would make to a man and not letting women's reticence impact what they're given.
I can't believe that gender should be a consideration for pay in any regard these days. It makes absolutely no sense. Similarly with race or with religion, it's all on competence. Yeah.
Absolutely. But it's decades of unconscious bias.
So your book is called Lead, and why don't you give us a quick overview of the book?
Well, I wrote the book in order to distill 25 years of experience, of expertise and education on this topic. And I knew that I would not be able to touch that many more women. And it was my way of creating kind of a coach in a book, a companion. And in it, what people have liked about it is that there are a lot of personal stories and a lot of one-line sources of wisdom. And at the end of each chapter, I have a whole series of recommended steps on how you can L, learn, E, engage, A, articulate a plan, and D, do it. So it's something that people can use over and over again. And the most common reaction is from women who are over 40 saying, I wish I had this book 20 years ago.
So the book is kind of a culmination of your work as a leadership coach and what you've experienced and found and what has been successful?
Yes. And it's different from other leadership books in that it deliberately starts with women's experience rather than trying to do gender comparisons or recommend what's worked for men to women. And I think that I have uncovered a number of issues that have often not been addressed in other leadership books. For instance, women are incredible performers. I always joke when I'm talking to women and say, just cut back to 100% from the 150 that you're currently working at, because you'll still be ahead of most of your colleagues. So they perform and perform and perform, and I've seen bosses not want to promote them because they don't want to lose them. But what they don't realize is that amount of performance does not lead to promotion, that there are other competencies that you need to develop. You need to be known. For instance, you need to be known by the executives who make those decisions. You need to demonstrate that you have skills beyond your area of expertise. What oftentimes people show in what's called a stretch assignment, where you're thrown into something and you demonstrate you can rise to the occasion. And the third is you have to be attentive to the culture and the norms and the life of an organization so that the current executives know that you will be effective if you're promoted.
Aside from being afraid to ask for more compensation, what is another mistake that you've seen over and over that women might do on a job interview like
One
that?
way women can strengthen their performance, how they come across, is paying attention to their language. And there are a number of things that you can see that women tend to use tentative language, like, I think I may be able to do that. Or they'll add too many words and say, I just want to ask you, could we find a time to possibly meet? Instead of saying, I need to talk to you. And that makes emails too long. It's distracting. And the third thing, and this comes from an experience I had with a client, is that women tend to use the pronoun we way too often. When they're talking about an accomplishment or what's going on, they're much more likely to say, we just accomplished, or we did this, rather than claiming their own accomplishments and saying I. And I have a great story in the book about a young, up-and-coming, smart, talented woman who, along with a male peer, Fred, was asked to do this pilot project for the CEO of a manufacturing company. And when they met with the CEO, he would say, well, last week I did, or last week I saw, and she would always say we. And so she came to me after this was going on for a while and said, she was really unhappy with what was happening. And I said, well, have you talked to Fred? And she was like, no, I can't do that because he'll just think I'm being overly sensitive, which is another thing women have to deal with. So then I said, well, why don't you try saying I once in a while? And she was equally outraged. But she went and she tried. And the next time I saw her, she was beaming because she had said, I did this and I was speaking to. And suddenly the CEO was paying attention and listening to her and applauding what she was accomplishing. And so she began to see that she needs a much fuller repertoire of pronouns in her vocabulary.
You know, it's funny you say that because my producer, who is a male, uses we constantly in his emails when he's referring to our show. He said, we did this, we did that, when it's actually he did it. I didn't have anything to do
Uh-huh,
with it.
uh-huh. Well, sometimes it's appropriate. I mean, we is certainly a wonderful pronoun, but there are times when it's important in a larger organization to claim what you have done.
It was funny. Well, Ellen, we do have to wrap this up. We are out of time. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
I do, and it's simply my name, ellensnee.com. You can find information about my coaching, my speaking, and opportunities, the book, you name it. It's all there in one place, ellensnee.com.
Okay, great. Well, Ellen, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your story. Very interesting. Best of luck with your book.